It was a quiet evening when Jessica, a young woman living alone in a quaint cottage, first noticed the odd behavior of her cat, Miko. He was a sleek black feline with bright green eyes, and while he had always been somewhat aloof, this night was different. For hours, Miko sat in front of a door in the hallway that led to the attic, his intense gaze never wavering. Jessica first assumed it was just a passing moment, a curious behavior perhaps sparked by the odd creaks of the house settling. But as time passed, Miko's obsession with the door grew. At first, she thought it was simply a reflection or something moving behind the door, but there was no draft, no shadows flickering. It was as if Miko was staring into something, or someone, that she could not see. Jessica had lived in the house for months, and she knew there was nothing behind that door except an old, unused attic full of forgotten boxes and dust. Still, the cat's unblinking stare made her uneasy, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As the hours dragged on, Miko did not move, not even to eat. His focus never wavered. Jessica tried calling his name, trying to snap him out of whatever trance he had fallen into, but nothing worked. The cat's gaze remained fixed, and an icy chill began to fill the room. It was as if something invisible, something sinister, was lurking just beyond the door. Jessica's heart began to race, and she found herself standing at the edge of the hallway, staring at the same locked door, wondering what could possibly be on the other side. Jessica couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling that had settled in her chest as Miko continued to stare at the locked door. The silence in the house grew oppressive, and it wasn't long before she began to wonder if there was something more to the house's history. She had only bought the cottage a few months ago, and though it was beautiful and charming, she had never bothered to learn much about its past. It was an old property, nestled on the outskirts of town, with towering trees casting long shadows over the front yard. The kind of place that looked picturesque from the outside but had an eerie presence at night. Jessica's curiosity got the better of her, and she decided to do some digging. The first place she went was the local library, hoping to find some records about the house and its previous owners. The librarian, a woman with graying hair and an air of secrecy about her, gave Jessica a curious look when she asked for information about the cottage. "Not many people inquire about that place," she said quietly, as if unsure whether to share anything. "It's been around for a long time, though. Just be careful of what you uncover." The librarian's cryptic warning only fueled Jessica's curiosity further. She was given a few old records, some newspaper clippings, and a few handwritten notes about the house, though most of the details were sparse. It seemed that the house had been abandoned for many years before Jessica moved in. But the more she read, the more strange details began to surface. The original owners, the Harringtons, were well known in town decades ago. They were wealthy and influential, but their time in the house was marked by odd occurrences. Several of the family's servants had mysteriously vanished, never to be heard from again. There were rumors about strange happenings in the attic, where the family had kept the door locked at all times. People in town whispered about the dark energy that seemed to radiate from the house, and the Harringtons had grown reclusive, rarely seen outside of the mansion. No one knew what truly happened to them. The house had been abandoned for years after their sudden disappearance, with no heirs to take possession of the property. Over the years, it changed hands several times, but each new owner either left in a hurry or disappeared without a trace. There was no clear reason for the house's eerie reputation, but the stories were enough to make anyone hesitate before stepping foot inside. Jessica felt a chill run down her spine as she read through the records. Was Miko somehow sensing the lingering energy of the house? Could the locked door have something to do with the tragic history of the Harringtons? The more she thought about it, the more she began to believe that Miko's strange behavior wasn't a random quirk. The cat wasn't just staring at an old door, he was staring at something from the past, something that had never truly left the house. Something that was tied to the attic, to the Harringtons, and to the dark secret that had been buried there for so long. She returned home that evening, her mind racing with the possibilities. As the sun set and the shadows grew long, Jessica sat in her living room, staring at the door Miko had been fixated on. The door was old and made of heavy wood, its surface worn with age. There was nothing particularly remarkable about it at first glance, just an ordinary door leading to an unused attic. But now, after learning about the house's history, Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that the door held something far more sinister. Something ancient and deeply unsettling. Miko was still sitting there, unmoving, his eyes locked on the door. The air in the house felt colder now, as though the temperature had dropped several degrees since her return. The atmosphere felt dense, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Jessica stood up and walked slowly toward the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the old brass knob. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she wondered whether she was being foolish, letting her imagination run wild. After all, she had always been a skeptic. But everything about the house, its eerie history, Miko's behavior, the strange coldness in the air, made her question what was real. As her fingers brushed the knob, a sudden sound echoed from above, like something heavy scraping against the floor of the attic. Jessica froze, her heart racing. The noise was faint but distinct, and it was enough to make her blood run cold. She had heard nothing before, and there was no logical explanation for the sound. It wasn't the wind, or the house settling, it was something else. Something that made her feel like she wasn't alone. Her hand recoiled from the doorknob, and she took a step back. Miko's eyes shifted slightly, but he didn't look away from the door. The cat's stillness was unnerving, as if he knew something Jessica didn't. She hesitated for a long moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Should she open the door and investigate what lay beyond? Or was it better to leave it locked and untouched, as it had been for so many years? In that instant, Jessica realized that whatever lay behind that door was not just a relic of the past. It was something that had been waiting. Waiting for someone to come. Waiting for someone to open it. And when Jessica finally made her decision, she didn't know whether it would be the beginning of something terrible, or the end. With a deep breath, Jessica made her decision. She wasn't sure what drove her to do it, but the call of the unknown had a power over her that she couldn't resist. She reached for the brass doorknob once more, her fingers more steady this time despite the racing of her heart. The cold air around her seemed to intensify, swirling in the hallway like a gathering storm. Miko, who had been perfectly still until now, let out a low, almost imperceptible growl. His gaze was unbroken, but his fur stood on end, and for the first time, Jessica felt like she wasn't alone in the hallway. She quickly turned the knob and pushed the door open, half expecting it to be stuck or locked in some way, but it creaked open with a sound that was too loud in the silence of the house. A draft of icy air rushed past her, making her shiver. The attic stairs loomed in front of her, dark and steep, disappearing into a void above. Jessica's pulse quickened as she stepped forward, her breath fogging in the cold air. She glanced back at Miko, who still sat by the door, his eyes unblinking, but there was an odd tension to his posture now. It was as if he were warning her, or perhaps urging her to turn back. But Jessica couldn't do that. She needed to know. Slowly, she ascended the stairs, the wooden steps creaking under her weight. With each step, the air grew colder, the darkness above more suffocating. Her flashlight, which she had taken with her for some semblance of light, flickered erratically, casting long shadows on the walls. As she reached the top, she hesitated, her hand gripping the flashlight tightly. The attic door was cracked open just slightly, and from within, Jessica could smell something musty, old, decayed. It wasn't the smell of dust or wood. It was something deeper, something more rotten. Her stomach turned, and for a moment, she wondered if she should just leave. Maybe the history of the house was enough of an explanation. Perhaps it was all just a strange, eerie coincidence. But as she pushed the door open, she realized there was no turning back. The attic was vast, more so than she had imagined. It was filled with old furniture covered in white sheets, stacks of yellowing boxes, and large, dusty crates. Everything was covered in layers of time. Yet, there was something off about the place. Despite the thick layer of dust, the space felt like it had been disturbed recently. Something had been moved. Her flashlight scanned the room, and the beam landed on something that made her freeze in place. In the far corner of the attic, beneath a pile of old blankets and sheets, was an antique chest. It was made of dark wood, old iron bands crisscrossing its sides, and it was locked. The chest looked out of place in the otherwise forgotten attic, and a cold dread filled Jessica's chest. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, to close the door and never return, but she couldn't resist. It was as if the chest was calling to her, urging her to uncover its secret. She slowly approached it, feeling a strange weight on her chest as she drew closer. As her hand brushed against the chest, A low whisper seemed to echo in her ears, a sound so faint, so soft, that she almost convinced herself it was in her head. But the whisper persisted, like a voice just out of reach, one she couldn't quite understand. With shaking hands, she crouched in front of the chest and examined it. There was a padlock, old and rusted, but it wasn't sealed tight. She could feel something inside the chest, pushing against the wood, as though it were barely contained. She grabbed the lock and, with some effort, managed to pry it open. The moment the lock clicked free, the air in the room seemed to shift. A heavy, oppressive force filled the space, as if something had just been awakened. Jessica held her breath as she slowly lifted the lid. Inside, it wasn't what she had expected. Rather than finding old relics or forgotten trinkets, the chest contained something far more horrifying. A large, intricately carved bone mask lay atop a pile of tattered, yellowed cloth. The mask was made of an unnatural, almost unsettling material, something that didn't resemble any bone or material she had seen before. It was black and glossy, reflecting the light in a way that made Jessica's skin crawl. Her fingers trembled as she reached for it, and when her hand made contact with the mask, a shock ran through her body. A sharp, sudden pain that shot up her arm, as if something from within the mask had clung to her. She pulled her hand away quickly, feeling a strange, prickling sensation as if the mask had drained some of her energy. The air grew even colder, and Jessica's breath caught in her throat. As she stepped back, she noticed something else at the bottom of the chest, a small, folded piece of paper. Her heart skipped a beat as she carefully unfolded it, the creaking of the paper the only sound in the room. The handwriting was old, almost illegible, but she could make out a few words. The door is the key. It will be unlocked. But what you will find is a terror beyond time, bound by blood and bone. Her mind raced, trying to process the cryptic message. What door was the note referring to? What terror had been bound for so long? And what did the mask have to do with it? As Jessica pondered these questions, she suddenly felt a presence behind her. It wasn't something she could see, but she could feel it, a dark energy lingering in the shadows. The temperature dropped further, and she could hear the faintest rustle, like whispers in the air, but no one was there. Jessica spun around, her flashlight trembling in her grip. But all she saw was the empty attic. The mask still sat in the chest, untouched, as though waiting for her. Jessica's mind raced as she stood in the attic, clutching the flashlight in her trembling hand, staring at the mask that seemed to gleam in the dim light. The whispers in the air grew louder, not in volume, but in their presence. She couldn't place them, couldn't understand the words, but they felt ancient, as though the very air around her was charged with something dark and powerful. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and a cold sweat formed on her brow. The feeling of being watched, of being surrounded by unseen eyes, grew stronger with each passing second. The mask seemed to pull her gaze toward it, almost hypnotically, as if it were alive, as if it had a will of its own. She fought the urge to reach for it again, to touch it, to uncover whatever dark power it held. But the pull was growing stronger. It was as if something inside her was urging her to uncover the truth, to unlock whatever ancient force had been sealed away for so long. She forced herself to turn away from the mask, her heart pounding in her chest as she glanced around the attic, trying to shake off the eerie feeling. But it was no use. The presence, the weight in the air, seemed to follow her every movement. It was as if the very walls of the attic were closing in on her, pressing down on her chest. Her head began to spin, and she staggered backward, her flashlight slipping from her grasp and rolling across the floor. She heard it clatter to the ground, but the sound seemed distant, muffled by the oppressive silence that filled the attic. She tried to steady herself, to take deep breaths, but it felt as if the air had thickened, as if the very room itself was suffocating her. And then, she saw it. A shadow, shifting in the corner of her vision. At first, she thought it was just her mind playing tricks on her, a figment of the growing panic that was clouding her thoughts. But when she looked again, it was there, darker than the shadows around it, moving with an unnatural fluidity. The shape was large, and for a brief moment, it seemed to take on a human form, its outline faint but unmistakable. It was as if something, or someone, was standing in the corner of the room, watching her. Jessica's heart skipped a beat, and her breath caught in her throat. Her legs felt like jelly, as if they could give out at any moment, but she forced herself to stand tall. She turned her body slowly, keeping her eyes locked on the corner where the shadow lingered. But when she faced it directly, the shadow was gone, disappearing into the darkness like a wisp of smoke. She blinked rapidly, her mind struggling to make sense of what she had seen. Could it have been a trick of the light? Or was it something else? Something far darker than she had ever imagined? She took a few cautious steps forward, toward the place where the shadow had been. She reached for the flashlight, her fingers brushing against the cool metal, and when she shone the beam in the corner, there was nothing there, just more dust, more forgotten relics. The sensation of being watched didn't leave, however. It was still there, lingering, pressing down on her chest like a weight she couldn't escape. The whispers were louder now, and they seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. They were no longer faint, indecipherable murmurs. Now they were distinct, clear, though still unrecognizable. Words she couldn't understand, in a language that seemed ancient, primal. Desperate, Jessica glanced back toward the chest, feeling the pull again. She knew, deep down, that whatever was inside that chest was the source of this power. The whispers, the shadow, the feeling of being trapped, all of it was tied to that mask, to the dark history of the house. Something was awakening, something that had been sealed away for centuries. With shaking hands, she reached for the mask again. The moment her fingers brushed against its surface, the whispers grew louder, swirling around her, filling her mind. Her vision blurred, and the room seemed to spin. The temperature dropped even further, and Jessica could see her breath fogging in the air. But it wasn't just the temperature that had changed. There was something else in the air now, a heavy, suffocating presence that seemed to envelope her from all sides. She tried to pull her hand away, but it was as if the mask had taken hold of her. It felt as though the mask was drawing her in, pulling her deeper into its dark grip. She stumbled backward, away from the chest, but the weight of the presence seemed to follow her, pressing in on all sides. The air grew thick, oppressive, and Jessica felt a sense of overwhelming dread settle over her. The whispers became clearer, the words starting to form into sentences. "You should not have opened it. You should not have come." The voice was low, guttural, like something ancient and primal speaking directly into her mind. Jessica's heart raced as she backed away further. The shadows in the attic began to shift again, but this time they didn't disappear. They coalesced, swirling into a form, a figure, standing tall and menacing in the corner. The figure was shrouded in darkness, its shape shifting and changing, flickering between a human form and something far more monstrous. Its eyes glowed faintly, a sickly, unnatural green that seemed to pierce through the darkness. "You are not meant to uncover the past," the voice continued, its tone chilling. "You have disturbed the binding. You have broken the seal." The figure stepped forward, and the air around Jessica grew heavier, thicker. She felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of nausea, her head spinning as the room seemed to close in on her. The whispers filled her mind, drowning out all other thoughts. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The figure reached out, its shadowy hands stretching toward her. In a moment of panic, Jessica turned and ran, her legs weak beneath her. She stumbled down the attic stairs, her mind numb with terror. The whispers chased her, the presence pressing against her like an invisible force, suffocating her as she descended. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she collapsed, gasping for air, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked up at the door that led back into the hallway, and for a moment, she thought she saw something move in the corner of her eye. But it was gone the next moment. Jessica scrambled to her feet, her pulse thundering in her ears. She barely even registered the feel of the old wooden floor beneath her, only that she had to get out of the attic. The suffocating air in the room, the whispering voices, and the terrifying presence behind her pushed her to act with a kind of frantic determination she didn't know she was capable of. As she sprinted toward the hallway, her mind raced with thoughts of escape, but there was something else too, a rising dread that the worst was yet to come. The door to the attic slammed shut behind her with an almost deafening bang, sending a shudder through the walls. She didn't dare turn around, not wanting to face whatever malevolent force had been released when she opened the chest. She reached the hallway, her breath ragged and uneven, but something told her that safety was still far out of reach. The whispers from the attic had not ceased. They seemed to follow her, drifting through the very walls, growing louder with every step she took. And then came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing from somewhere behind her. Jessica's heart skipped a beat. She didn't need to look to know what was coming. She had felt the presence, seen the shadow, and now it was following her. It wasn't just an echo or a figment of her imagination. Whatever had been awakened was moving, hunting her. Panic surged in her chest as she ran down the hallway, but the house felt different now. The walls seemed to close in on her, the floors creaking and groaning beneath her feet as if the house itself was alive, responding to the malevolent force she had unleashed. The oppressive atmosphere pressed down on her, suffocating, heavy. Her breaths were shallow, her mind clouded with fear, and yet, despite every instinct telling her to flee, there was an undeniable pull back to the door. The door she had unlocked, the door that had been a key to something far darker than she had ever imagined. She reached the living room, but the sound of the footsteps grew louder still, the presence closing in on her like a storm. It was as if the house was no longer her refuge. It was a trap, a maze built to imprison her, to keep her from escaping whatever dark power had been waiting all these years. With trembling hands, she grabbed the front door handle, yanking it open, only to find it stuck. She tugged harder, but the door wouldn't budge. It was as if it had become part of the house itself, bound to it, to whatever dark force had been awakened. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. The footsteps were closer now, too close, and she could feel the presence just behind her, like an icy hand resting on her shoulder. She whirled around, her eyes wide with terror, but the room was empty. No one was there. Yet the feeling of being watched, of being stalked, was palpable. The house was alive with it. She stumbled back from the door, her mind spinning with dread, trying to think of some way out. It was in that moment, that terrifying moment of helplessness, that she heard the voice again. It was the same guttural ancient voice she had heard in the attic, but this time it wasn't just in her mind. It was real. It reverberated in the room, in her very bones. You cannot leave. The door is the key. You have opened it. You have let it out. The words sank into her like a cold, iron weight. It was the same voice she had heard in the attic, but it was now within her own walls. The shadows in the room stretched and writhed, taking on shapes that were no longer just shadows. Figures formed from the darkness, their forms faint and shifting, but their presence undeniable. Jessica's mind reeled as the room around her warped and twisted. The walls seemed to pulse with the energy of something old, something primal, as if the very foundation of the house had been built upon an ancient curse. The floor beneath her feet seemed to tremble, as though the house itself was shuddering in response to the presence that now occupied it. The whispering grew louder, louder still, until it felt as though her ears would burst from the sheer volume of it. The words were incomprehensible, but their meaning was clear. It's here. It's been waiting. The figures from the shadows moved toward her. She backed up against the door, her hands grasping the knob with desperation. She had to escape. She had to get out before whatever had been unleashed consumed her too. But as she pushed with all her strength, the door remained locked, bound to something far darker than just a simple latch. The figures moved closer, their forms becoming more solid with every step. Their faces were twisted, their eyes hollow, and their mouths were frozen in a silent scream. They were the remnants of something long past, bound to this house, to the mask, to the terror that had been locked away. You have disturbed what should not be disturbed, the voice echoed louder now. You have opened the door. You are the key. Jessica's breath hitched as the figures reached her, their cold hands brushing against her skin. The touch was like ice, like death itself. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the whispers, by the darkness that enveloped her. The shadows closed in, and she felt the weight of them pressing down on her, suffocating her. And then, nothing. For a moment, everything went silent. The oppressive darkness, the whispers, the figures, they were gone. Jessica stood alone in the living room, her body trembling, her mind racing. The coldness was still there, but it was no longer as suffocating. She looked around, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no time for that. The door was still locked. She had to get out. She had to leave before the curse of the house consumed her too. But as she reached for the door again, a realization dawned on her. She hadn't just unlocked a door, she had opened something far more terrifying than she could have ever imagined. The house was not just haunted by spirits or shadows. It was alive with a dark force that had been waiting for someone, for anyone, to release it. And now, Jessica was that someone. She was the key. Jessica's fingers were numb as they pressed against the cold, unyielding door. Every inch of her body screamed for release, for escape, but the door refused to yield. It was as though the house itself was holding her captive, keeping her in this nightmare. The chilling whispers began to swirl around her again, not just from the shadows but from the walls, from the floor, from the very air itself. They were louder now, more insistent, as though they were trying to communicate something more urgent, something far more terrible. The darkness in the room had deepened, becoming an entity all on its own. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her heart racing in her chest. She felt trapped, cornered, but she knew deep down that there was only one way to break free. She had to face it. The house, the mask, the presence, it was all connected. The curse wasn't just in the mask. It was in the house itself. The curse had been waiting, dormant for so long, and when Jessica had unlocked that chest, when she had touched the mask, she had triggered something much darker than she could have ever realized. The house had been waiting for someone to open the door. It had been waiting for her. But there was one last piece to the puzzle she had yet to uncover. As she stared at the door, her eyes were drawn to a faint, etched symbol in the wood, something she hadn't noticed before. It was old, ancient, and faintly glowing with a sickly green light that seemed to pulse with every beat of her heart. The symbol was familiar, though she couldn't place it at first. She reached out and traced the symbol with her fingertips, feeling the chill run through her body once again. It was a warning, she realized. A warning left behind by whoever had built this house. A warning about what would happen if the door was opened. The more she traced the symbol, the more the whispers grew. They were no longer just whispers. Now, they were voices, low and menacing, growing clearer as if they were speaking directly into her mind. The door is the key. The blood is the lock. You have unlocked what should not be freed. The voice sounded ancient, older than time itself, and it filled Jessica's mind like an overwhelming flood of darkness. She recoiled from the door, clutching her head as the weight of the voices bore down on her. But there was no escaping it. No escaping the truth. She had set something free, something that had been trapped for centuries. And it was now coming for her. The door trembled as the voices grew louder, more frantic. The shadows in the room flickered and writhed, moving closer to her. They were no longer just shadows, but figures, tall, looming figures that seemed to form out of the darkness itself. They had no faces, no clear shapes, only the sensation of immense, suffocating power. They were the embodiment of whatever had been trapped behind that door. The house groaned as if it were alive, shifting and creaking under the strain of what had been unleashed. The temperature plummeted further, and Jessica's vision blurred with frost. The figures moved closer, their forms becoming clearer. They were humanoid in shape, but their features were distorted, twisted, faces that seemed to flicker between human and something far more monstrous. Their hands were long, elongated, covered in sharp, bony ridges, and their eyes were hollow, voids of darkness that seemed to suck in the very light around them. Jessica staggered backward, her heart pounding as the figures closed in. The walls seemed to pulse, bending and shifting as though the very house was a living, breathing entity. She couldn't escape. There was nowhere to run. The presence that had followed her since she first opened the door was no longer something distant. It was here. It was real. And it was coming for her. She turned back to the door, desperate, her fingers trembling as they once again touched the symbol etched into the wood. The whispers intensified, and in that moment, she understood. The symbol was not just a warning. It was the key. The door had to be sealed. She had to close it, shut whatever had been unleashed back inside before it consumed her, before it consumed everything. She pulled back, grabbing anything she could to brace the door, but the shadows moved with terrifying speed. They were no longer just a presence. They were tangible, reaching for her with claws that seemed to stretch from the darkness itself. "You cannot close it," the voice crooned, its tone mocking, filled with malice. "You are the key. You opened it. You belong to us now. Jessica could feel the weight of the darkness pressing down on her, suffocating her, pulling her toward the door. The house groaned and shuddered, as though the very walls were reaching for her, pulling her toward the void. But then, a flicker of light. Miko. The cat had been quiet for so long, but now he appeared at her side, his fur standing on end, his eyes wide and glowing with an unnatural light. He stepped forward, his tail swishing in a slow, deliberate motion. He wasn't just a cat anymore. There was something about him, something ancient in his eyes. The whispering shadows recoiled as if they were afraid, and Jessica realized, with a jolt of horror, that Miko was the key. The cat had been guarding this house, guarding the door, long before she had ever arrived. His presence was the final piece of the puzzle. He was the one who had been keeping the darkness at bay. Without him, the door had been unlocked. But now, Miko was here to protect her. He stepped forward, his fur glowing with an eerie light. As he approached the door, the shadows hissed, retreating into the walls, into the corners of the room. The house groaned again, but this time, it wasn't in anguish. It was in fear. Miko's eyes glowed brightly as he placed his paw on the symbol etched into the door. The air seemed to vibrate with energy as the whispers ceased, replaced by a single unified voice, one that was more primal, more ancient than anything Jessica had ever felt. "You cannot stop us," the voice whispered, but it was no longer as certain. There was fear in it now. "You have freed us, and you cannot undo it. The door cannot be closed." But Miko didn't falter. His glow intensified, and with a sudden, powerful movement, he swiped his paw across the symbol. The door trembled violently, and the shadows screamed, their forms disintegrating into the darkness as the door slammed shut with an enormous bang. The house shook violently, the floor beneath Jessica's feet cracking and groaning under the strain of the dark force trying to escape. But it was too late. The door was sealed once more. Silence fell. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, and the temperature slowly returned to normal. Jessica collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath, her heart still racing. The house, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, was silent. The darkness had been driven back, and the house had finally returned to its dormant state. But Jessica knew that it wasn't over. The door had been sealed, yes, but something had been awakened, and something was still out there. The house, its curse, its darkness, they were still waiting. And she would never be the same again.